I think you just had an extraordinary experience with these three. These were absolutely three fabulous. I mean, I just was amazed. And I asked for one of them. I'm going to get the other two and actually send them to Kara Walker and say, look, this is why I want to get this exhibition to Laramie. But I want to come at this a different way. So what are you doing here? What are you doing here? Why are you here?
I'm here because my teacher wanted me to be. But
why are you here?
For my position in the student government.
Why are you here?
I'm interested in the subject matter.
So let me ask you, last week in Africa, Boko Haram slaughtered a village of 50 people. Okay, that were trying to run away from them. What are you going to do about it? What are you going to do about it?
I don't know.
In Pakistan last week, a woman was raped. Her family felt she would dishonor them. They stoned her to death. What are you going to do about it? What are you going to do?
I don't know.
We got the Kurds, the Shiites, and the Sunnis all killing each other, all trying to go crazy in Syria. Okay, 5 million people have left. What are you going to do about it?
I don't know.
I see. In Israel, you got the Palestinians stuck in that zone. Okay? They're being used as pawns by powers around them. The Israelis are afraid that they'll be too large a vote and Israel will no longer be a Jewish state. Meantime, everybody's, starting to stab each other at night and knock off people on both sides. What are you going to do about it?
I don't know.
Ukraine. Okay, it was doing pretty well, and then Putin decided that it wanted to sort of take over Ukraine. It's a mess right now. What are you going to do about it?
I'm going to keep teaching children.
And in China last week, the United Nations had a UNESCO thing, I think it was like 1981, and they created in China, some women came together and created a women's rights group that helped women empower themselves and so forth. Last week, the premier shut it down and disbanded it. What are you going to do about it?
Raise my son and daughter to be feminists.
All right. So I think the talks that you just heard over here were from Peter and Colleen and Carrie were incredible. But I think the reason why you're here is because these are just monstrous issues. Okay? And the fact is, the reason why you're here, I believe, is because we, those of us who are a bit older, don't have those answers. All those bright folks in Congress here and in Britain and all around the world, there are monstrous problems all around us. And they're all involving these same themes, okay, of people that hate other people, the whole power trip, the Russia thing, Ukraine, the gender issues, the tribes. Okay. They are just horrible, horrible issues, just like the themes here, okay, are those themes. Now, I don't know how to solve those problems, because if I did, I certainly wouldn't be here in front of you. I'd be somewhere else trying to solve those. Okay? But these are the problems of your time. Okay? And you have to solve them. The I don't know isn't good enough. Because you can't graduate from here and go back to your nice towns or worry tonight about going to some party. Okay? That's not what Kara Walker wants you to do. Okay? What she wants you to do is try to see if there are answers in this work that can help you try to get a perspective, try to get a new idea, so that in a few years when you're out of here, you're the one stepping up and trying to solve these monstrous, monstrous problems of all the themes you just heard about, the inequality, the race, all the issues you already heard. That's why you're here. Because these answers, there's the answers that you have to come up with that are yet unknown. They're in these works. That's what she's doing. That's what Kara Walker's doing. She is putting up on these walls for you the toughest, toughest themes in human society. And they unfortunately have plagued us since Lucy in Africa wandered out from the plains. So good luck.
Thank you, Jordan. So now is the fun part of the evening, that we're opening it up to all of you to begin the discussion, to begin the dialogue. And what I'd like to do is take the mic around, and if you have a question for any of our panelists, I'll ask you to speak it into the microphone so we can get it on video. So with that, are there any questions? And if there are, raise your hand high for me.
Thank you. Could we hear a little bit more from Dr. Pimblatt and Dr. Fine about what they're doing with their classes in relation to the exhibit?
So in my class, I teach African American history from 1619 to the present. And right now we're in the pre-colonial West African section of our course. And so we're already planning to come out here to use the fabulous teaching gallery, which has West African exhibits in it this semester. And we will be here on Thursday for that purpose. But when I learned that Carol Walker's work was going to be here, I reoriented the entire section on enslavement, which is the bulk of my class, because enslavement was the bulk of the Black experience in the United States in terms of time. And so we will be here looking at these images as a way to discuss the kinds of things that I just articulated in the talk, emancipation, and whether emancipation was an approximation or whether it was realized. And I think her work hints obviously at that answer. And then we'll also be using it as a way to talk about Black women's experiences within slavery and representations of Black women's experiences within slavery. And so we will be using a class blog to create, students will be charged with analyzing an individual artifact from in here, specific image, and they will be putting it in its context using historical sources, primary and secondary, to wrestle with those kinds of themes of race, gender, and representation in the context of the antebellum and Emancipation South.
Yeah, so I'm teaching this class right now called Visualizing Race. And as I mentioned, I've only taught it to grad students before, so this is the first time with undergrads. And what we're going to be doing in the class is it's a seminar studio course. And what we'll do, we'll spend some time here looking at this work. I would have spent quite a bit of time looking at her work anyway, but this provides a great opportunity. So we do a lot of about race and representation related to both art and science to a certain degree, and how through looking we define. So that's basically the overall theme of it. And then, for instance, I did my MFA work on whiteness, so I explored my own racial identity, or the lack thereof, as I thought at the time, which didn't turn out to be true. I have some experience with that, with making, and one of the things I really want the students to take away from that class in particular is that when African American artists are making, when they're producing work, there's more of, I don't know, there's more punch to it, certainly when they're engaging directly with these themes. Because as I was talking in my talk, our consumer economy, beginning in the 19th century, it began with these racialized images of Aunt Jemima and so forth, and they were literally packaged with these figures on them, and they operated as a way to show that their labor was still contained, right? So after slavery, then the Black figures were still contained. They were still captured within a box or on an image, on tin, in paperboard, on wood, etc., and that they were still laboring. They were still, you know, not having leisure time per se. But that led to more leisure time for other people. So there's just a poignancy to it that's really specific. The other thing we're going to do is take this DNA test, which is very fascinating because it does tell you whether you've had any racial admixture in the last 500 years or so since the conquest and colonization, the transatlantic slave trade. So that's very interesting. Yeah, I'm trying to think what else. Lots of stuff.
I am a Republican, but I've been very impressed by Barack Obama in the last 5 years. And I can't help but think sometimes if his message is not given a chance partially because of his race. It seemed like even on my own side of the party during his speech, a lot of the Republicans were sitting there just kind of scowling at him. And what I see him encapsulating is what is happening in the future, which is change, that we cannot sit by. Change is here. It's here to stay. And whether we like illegal immigration, we need policies that address that. We need to live in change. But I guess there's been certain times I've been sad thinking that Obama hasn't been listened to simply because of his race. And then the other thing I was going to touch on is that I feel like also in this day and age there's reverse discrimination, where some white people can start to be discriminated against simply because they're white, just as it is for black people as well, or any race for that matter. So I guess in your response, Mr. Schnitzer, to what am I going to do, I'm going to try to change the world the best I know how, and I'm going to put my hat in it and not give up until we solve it. So that's all I got.
I think one of the things that Kara Walker is suggesting in her work is that racial stereotypes are not past, and these racial ideologies inform how we think in our society in the present. And so I would argue, yes, that President Obama and his perception in the public is shaped by these racial stereotypes also, and he has to walk a very fine line in how he represents himself in light of the tightrope that is these racial stereotypes. And so I think that is part of what Kara Walker is wrestling with, specifically as it pertains to black women. I'm interested in how she represents African American men in her work. I actually think, a little different. And so I would say in her work she would answer that question, yes. In terms of reverse racism, just a simple comment on that, which is that when I teach it on reverse racism in my intro class, I deny that it exists, because racism requires not just prejudice, which is individual dislike for and a set of ideas about another person to do with their racial identity, that is a judgment. It also requires a system of discrimination in practice. And the power of Euro-Americans is so expansive, and has been historically for the reasons that we see in all of these images, right? This history means that prejudice cannot be backed up with discrimination to make reverse racism a reality. So people can individually dislike each other. Often people have very good reasons to, based on this history. But reverse racism for me is a bit of a myth in that sense.
Thank you. So, Dr. Denny and Dr. Fine, I wanted to explore an intersection between both of your talks. Dr. Denny, you talked about Kara Walker's offering a form of resistance to the domestic representations of women in the domestic sphere. But then, Dr. Fine, you talked about blackness as a commodity. And to me, I see like commodification or consumability and the domestic sphere being almost inversions of each other, where those two ideas might cross, or if they run parallel.
It's complicated, right? So like these images exist in a historical timeline, and they continue to have latent regressive tendencies. They come back and forth. But there's certain points in time where, for instance, let's say talk about the domestic sphere, right? So the domestic sphere is created, as Colleen was talking about, by industrialization, right? So prior to industrialization, people, labored in cottage industries or in farming or et cetera. The plantation was made to seem like an ideal, like especially later, like post-emancipation and in the creation of what became to be called the New South, right? Which was an agreement between the North and the South to come to terms after the terms were made, like in the early 20th century. So after industrialization, the labor that people produced in the home, the objects, the things they produced in the home, that changed. So the role of women largely became one of consumption, right? So that's one thing. But in that period, in that nascent consumer culture, a lot of the objects that were coming, the designed objects and images that were coming in the home were coming through things like pancake mix and so forth, right? So Aunt Jemima, right? And so she's a racialized caricature. She was actually performed by a woman named Nancy Green at World's Fairs and expos expos and so forth. So she would make pancakes. And there's a whole tradition of ideas of folklore of black folks passing on recipes to white folks. And it really has more to do with suckering people and, raising them up. You see a lot of the mammy characters here. That's all part of that. So I would say that in that period, if you're talking about post-Civil War, Reconstruction, Jim Crow, there was that was when everything was in transition. And so it's a little confusing, but it's definitely there, right? So as I said before, the idea behind some of those characters was to make you feel comfortable with an industrial product, right, that you're not producing anymore. But there was also the myth that was also simultaneously being established that there was really this sort of ideal plantation life, right? But it wasn't even pastoral in the way that we think of it. It was actually, a very industrialized system of labor. And it was, of course, tied to the industrial North, but so that's just part of it, I would say. Colleen, do you want to?
Yeah, I was going to go with the Aunt Jemima on the pancake box kind of image too, because it really does sort of conflate that whole idea of commodity and the domestic, right? And the continuation of that construct for us and that stereotype is definitely there.
Right, and you saw the image that Colleen presented, Betty Saar's image of the Aunt Jemima within the box, I think. And that's really about containing labor, also black labor, because once people are emancipated, well, who's going to control that labor? And there's a lot of fears about mobility, right? So as there's a black middle class emerging, they're also buying these things too, but they're looking at it, they're being misrepresented, right? But so they're caught up in until there's always complicity, of course, when we buy things, when we sell things, when we produce things. But yeah, so I think that I was really interested in what Colleen was where she was going with the body itself, right? And the body as being a vessel and an object, because once you objectify somebody and you see them as a stereotype, you can fill that person with whatever you want. Disgust, love, you can do those things simultaneously, oddly enough, right? And so that's a big part of this history that Kara Walker is exposing to us is, like she talks about her book, My Emancipator, My Lover, I can't remember the full title of it, I have it written down somewhere. And it's just, you really see my compliment, my lover, my emancipator, all those things mixed together. So that confusion of human emotion and human objectification, so.
And there's that one image in the Emancipation Approximation, it's on this wall, of the black woman silhouette holding up the white woman silhouette in the big ball gown. And that to me is a really good image that addresses that subordinate role within the household, right? It's by the fruit of her labors and literally on her back that white woman is existing. It's an excellent question. They really do they fight against each other, but they come together as ideals, as ideas.
I was also wondering specifically about the woman's body as the house, but then also looking at images of female slaves who have become the commodity, and so that history that conflation begins to evolve as a result of the Industrial Revolution, but also in just the very nature of slavery.
Mm-hmm. I think we've talked about kind of the silo and the box and fitting in these stereotypes. So my question is for the panel, but also to the audience. So if any of you care to respond, please raise your hand. But how can we all be brave when it comes to social change?
Well, I'll just say, there's a lot of art students here, and, what artists and designers, writers do is they make things, right? So it's through the act of making, right? So you're engaging with a material, whether you're a painter, you're a ceramicist, you're working in wood, or you're working in a commercial field like design, like I've done for most of my adult life, either working in it or teaching it. And so you're always engaging with materials, and those things have meanings, and then you're engaging with the medium itself, the larger medium of what you're working in, and then that work becomes public. I mean, it's supposed to be in the public sphere, and once you put your work out there in the public sphere, there's the potential for change. I think Kara Walker affects a lot of change, and there's a lot going on right now that wasn't going on when, for instance, when I was working on my MFA in 2001 to 2004 in terms of like just hearing the words. I had to seek out, you know, texts on whiteness. I had to seek out critical theory on race and representation to really find it. But it's with social media now, it's ever present. So I would say it's, I don't know about how the term brave, I'm not so sure about, but like I think it's just about you making and putting your work out there and owning what you make, you know, and understanding its history too. And Kara Walker, I mean, if you think it's easy to make this kind of work, I would think again. And so that's very brave. I mean, it's extremely brave what she does. It's very difficult to make difficult work, you know, and she's complicating it. So she's not making it simple, she's complicating it, but that's what's revealing the complexity of the relationships, you know, right? So like Ralph Ellison said, you know, white Southerners can't do anything, I can't even remember the exact quote, but sing, dance, eat, make love, marry, you know, anything without thinking of African Americans, right? So it's so tied up. You know, especially in Southern culture, we talk about that, which is principally what she's doing, so that's why I bring it up.
I think that the work that she has presented is extraordinarily brave in the sense that it challenges multiple communities. The most obvious one that people will look at today and think about from this audience most likely is the way in which it challenges dominant understandings of black identity and white identity. But it does that in the context of a black aesthetic and literary tradition too, from quite a controversial standpoint, and in a way that I said was, and most scholars have referred to as ambiguous. It explores parts of African American history, at least I'm convinced by this from some of the scholarship that I've read on her work, particularly that of Roderick Ferguson and Gwendolyn Du Bois-Shaw, who argue that her work really challenges, in my discipline of African American history, a kind of nationalist narrative that calls for pure heroes, of a victim history that doesn't also leave room for black people to be human beings full of complexities. And I'd like to draw a parallel that I've been wrestling with for the past couple of weeks while writing about Kara Walker to contemporary political struggles around how African Americans are represented in police brutality cases, which is that there's a respectability politics that has demanded that African Americans be pure victims, that when they are murdered by law enforcement, that they have to be perfect, innocent victims. They cannot be human beings, meaning that they have human personalities and moralities, complexities. And so I think part of what Walker's work is doing for me is demanding that black people be allowed to be human, warts and all, and that they be able to desire things that are taboo, and to have complex emotions and moralities that don't always ring as perfect or noble and true. And I think she's wrestling, and this would just be my assumption, it may not be true, she may say something different herself, but I think she's wrestling with that complexity in herself. And when she does that, she conflicts with nationalist histories within my discipline that very rightly have called for a respectability politics that represents black people in a very specific way for very obvious political reasons, right? And that's what I was referring to the comment earlier about Barack Obama, which is that Barack Obama has to walk that line every single day of how he represents himself as an African-American man in this society, right? So that's something that is, in terms of the conversation white folks are gonna have about this stuff, that we're not part of and we're not privy to often. It's a conversation that often African-American studies folks have in private behind closed doors. But it's something that she puts out into a very white art world. And that raises all kinds of controversies. So for me, I think that's very brave. And I also think that it's very important because I think part of the bravery we have to have in our own moment in terms of struggling around issues of racial justice in the present is to fulfill that battle for true emancipation and full human actualization that lets people not be stereotypes, either positive or bad, right? But allows them to be the full human version of themselves. And for me, that's what I find most compelling about her work.
It's interesting. I don't know if any of you watched the PBS special where they trace back your history, your ancestry. So 3 weeks ago, maybe it was a repeat, but they were doing Kara Walker, and they traced back her history to the early 1800s, and she'd only known back to like 1880 or something. I think it was her great-great-grandfather was a white slave owner, and she never knew that. I think his name was Chase. And the show does an amazing job going to all sorts of church records and county records and whatever. And it was fascinating watching her. I don't think it was I don't think they tell the people from her reaction was, she was contemplative but stunned. And I thought, here, the irony of here you have her dealing with these issues, and then how did she deal with, after that show, that reality. And I think it was interesting on that show, there was a Hollywood actor on one of those sitcoms I don't watch, and a Caucasian guy whose his great-grandfather was African American. And then there was that Donna Brazil, who's like vice chairman of the Democratic Party and been a state legislature in Georgia, I think it is, and whatever, and a well-known commentator. And she always thought her name Brazil came from Brazil or something, and they traced that back, and she had a colonel, a white slave owner was her great-great-grandfather or something, whatever. I think back to the question you asked before, when I pushed you on those bigger issues, my point of that was, as I said to the smaller group over there, our artists are always chroniclers of our time. And that's why I also said, as you've heard so eloquently, gosh, fabulous, is these themes are far more than just about the black-white relations. They talk about all these themes which have been brought up, and that's why they're so universal and so critical. And they do relate to all those issues all around the world. And on my other point, yes, this is your time now in your lives to help solve those monstrous problems. But right now, what you can all do, I think, is, and what this show should help you do, is work on yourself first. We all jump to stereotype. It just happens, and you have to catch yourself. You're human. We're all human. And you'll start seeing people of a certain race or this or educated or not or whatever, and it just happens. You just start making some assumptions, and you find that in yourself. And the first to be the best you can be is you've got to guard yourself from your humanity of reacting to stereotyping and so forth. The second thing is you need to then band together and stand up when you see that inhumanity, when you see those issues that women pay in this country. It averages 61 to 81% of men's pay. Okay? You've got to help solve that. Okay? You've got to demand that's got to change. Why does that exist? Okay? You have to help both the men there and the women there in our real estate industry. God, it's tough to get senior. We have our 265 people, 147 are women. And we've got some fabulous stories there I'm so proud of. And we've taken some gals that have been on the street and had them work as receptionists, and they moved on up and we paid for education, and now they're senior property managers and have their families, and the letters I get just touch my heart. Yes, I'm in business to make money. You need to make a profit when you're in business. On the other hand, you're part of a community. A company's part of a community. When you do those things, that's what brings you the joy. So the point is, you've got to stand up. You've got to, in your own way, guard against things in yourself and stand up with others as a community when you see intolerance towards others, and work together to change one community, one neighborhood, one block, one community, one city at a time. And that's what I think she speaks to all of you, to break it down into a smaller piece, and what I think when you walk out of here. You're going to be moved, you are moved by this, by what you consciously see, and by subtly and unconsciously things that are going on. And it's interesting, please come back a second time. And when you come back that second time, see how you have a different reaction to what you saw that first time. And that's if there's any reason why we wanted to get the show here, is because, it's a pretty white community here. And thought it'd be good to get her work, to get this brilliant person to speak to all of you in your own way. So, and boy, with all the things you're going to do with all the classes, that just is incredible. Fabulous. But just think, as I said, it's when you feel yourself reacting to someone or whatever, someone that's not as smart or this or different color, whatever it all is, okay, that's a real feeling. But then you've got to snap back and say, wait a second, what am I doing? How did I fall into that human trap? When you see someone else making some comment or whatever, you've got to say, hey, you can't really mean that. Come on now. That's how it's got to start.
It seems that often when an individual wants to make a choice that would be stereotypical of the demographic they belong to, like a woman wanting to be a housewife or a young black man wanting to go into the rap business, they often receive no support from activists, or they might even be vilified by activist groups. How do we balance individual freedoms with what might be best for society, such as reducing stereotypes?
Well, you mentioned the individual, and I would say that in terms of, if we're talking about representations, right? So we're talking about art in the public eye, it's meant to be public. But usually when we talk about the individual in the US, what we mean are white individuals, because that's the way a white person is treated. They're treated as an individual. So I touched on this a little bit in my talk, which is the notion of double consciousness, which is a term that was coined by W.E.B. Du Bois, and he understood as an African American what he called the Negro at that time. This is the 19th century. That you have to carry around as an African American. He carried around an image of himself, his exterior image, how other people saw him. And he had to keep that front up all the time in order to be safe and not to put himself in jeopardy and so forth. And then also carry his internal reality of who he really is. So when we talk about individuality in the United States, we're usually talking about individuals who are not grouped into certain groups. And that process of being grouped and not being seen as individuals is a very complex one. I'm not sure individual choices need to be vetted by activists. So I'm not sure about that part of it. But the way, if we're talking about the way that we see, whenever we look, we define. That's just the truth of it. And that has happened over time through art, through science. And so that things that look just a little unfamiliar to us suddenly become strangely unfamiliar, and things that seem just a little bit familiar seem very familiar. So when we look at someone, we may see them as very familiar, even though that we have no relationship to them. So that would be my answer to that.
This is kind of over a broader themes of the show, but I was just wondering if you guys could comment on the sexuality and violence themes that are showed usually in conjunction with each other, and how that is continuing today through like the dominant narrative of what the antebellum era represented. So if you could just talk a little bit about that.
One of the influences for Carol Walker is pornographic literature, and she believes that these images are central to pornographic literature, and narratives of the antebellum South have been a form of titillation for readers in the present. So yes, these images are of the past, and yet they're also images about sexuality in the present, and how race and sexuality operates in often sadomasochistic ways in American culture, in which black women are, in one interpretation of their images, victims of this, and yet are represented often as pleasured by this, because this is an image that's controlled by people in power, right? So I would say that's kind of there's some good material that I've read, but I think there could be a lot more done on this about the more complex aspects of how we interpret sadomasochism within her work. But I think that's what I've read that I found most persuasive about this. Mm-hmm.
Can I ask one question that I think... I was at the University of Virginia last week for an opening of a show by Richard Serra. He's the one that does those big sculptures that Corten steel and does amazing works on paper. And we're with a bunch of the professors there and so forth, and a theme came up, which I'd love to have the panel's reaction to. And that was, they brought up that in New Orleans that day, well, there's been a series of, because the image of the Stone Mountain that was presented, there have been a number of statues and public of Confederate leaders that communities have felt have been horrible, and they've taken them down. Now, last week in Oxford, they made a decision not to take Cecil Rhodes' names off that school and whatever. And we sat there, and I asked that question of the woman who runs the Monticello, Jefferson's home, the executive director, and the president of the university, and some others, about what they thought. I mean, was this good or bad? What do you do with this issue? Because I was thinking about Thomas Jefferson, and it's an amazing place, Monticello, and the history and what you learn as he was a big slave owner. And he writes how in his writings he thought it was abhorrent and horrible and so forth, and yet he didn't know, he was so torn about it, didn't know what to do. On the other hand, economically, he could not have operated his farm without that labor. And in the end, he freed 5 of his slaves of the 140 he had. And then there's the whole history of Sally Hemings that I think many of you know, who was a half-sister to his wife, and then his wife died, and he had a number of children with Sally Hemings. But how do you feel about that? How do you react when someone says, boy, we should take this statue, Robert E. Lee, down because of what he represented, or this colonel, or this one, or that one, or so forth? What do you do about those issues? And if you start that, where do you stop? Do we suddenly say, look, Jefferson was a slave owner. Look at Washington. I mean, every town in this country, there's Jefferson High School, or a fascinating issue. And what do you do? How would you react to that?
I think when Carrie was talking about pure victims, you know, I mean, I think you mentioned heroes or heroism as well. And I think the fact that these monuments and statues are heroic in their qualities, like I think it's different than naming a town or a county, Washington or Jefferson. I think those things will persist. But in terms of the monuments and so forth, they are presented as heroes, right? And then there's also this other false narrative that we've discussed of the lost cause and the establishing of the New South, a new economic model that looked at the antebellum period as an ideal period, right? So I think in the case there, I think it's up to those communities. I mean, in New Orleans, it's pretty obvious when they decided to take down that statue, the majority black population was not particularly well represented by, and I can't remember who it was in particular, a general of some sort. So I think it depends. Like, I have roots in the South, but and in the North, but I grew up in the North. So obviously I'm not going to be as empathetic or sympathetic to that Southern cause. Right? Like, I can join the Sons of the Confederacy. I choose not to, though.
I think one of the challenges with it for me is the absence of representations that compete with those. So those images become our national narrative, and they become part of a kind of truth tale that's as fictional as this lost cause narrative is, right? That people buy into to this day is kind of reflective of their heritage in the case of Southern whites often. So that, for me, that part of that is troubling, and that's why I have been very supportive, I guess, in my mind and energy, of students that have specifically made demands here and in South Africa of the removal of these monuments. But as a historian, I also worry that I want those monuments not to be erased. I want a critical approach to those monuments. And even more importantly for me, and I say it's particularly important here in Laramie, it's something we're working on in my other class this semester, is I want the erasure of black people's experiences and stories to be addressed, right? That their counter-narratives, which are, in some cases, I think this is what Walker's wrestling with, are also constructed fictions, right? But I think, and I do buy this, I'm kind of more in the Du Bois school, that I think there is greater truth to these stories, empirically. So where I wrestle with Walker in this case, is that I think that needs to be reinstalled onto our landscape. We need counter-narratives of these kind of larger mythologies. Here in Laramie, the way that I'd see that happening in our own community is that we had a lynching in our community in the early 19th century, in the early 20th century, and we have no landmark on our landscape that indicates that large numbers of white people within our community participated in incidents of mob violence at 7th and Grand. And so black people's lives and their sacredness as part of our community is erased, and yet images of people that were slaveholders who participated in the subjugation of black people are memorialized and deified. That power relation for me, I guess, is the problem that I have with that, in that it's not being competed against by anything, and it's not being critiqued by, maybe a little marker at the side that puts Jefferson in his context or explains other aspects of what was foundational to our nation's history.
The conclusion that academic group reached is it was wrong to take these statutes down. They should be used for discussion and conversation, and there should be panels, there should be a balance of trying to put in context of the time what these folks did and how our views have changed today.
Fantastic. Thank you all for coming today. We strongly believe in the discussions created and flowing from this week's program will help all of us effect positive change in our communities. I think the conversation started here tonight is just the beginning of that. I like Jordan's kind of challenging, inspirational challenge, I guess, for all of us to come back and revisit this work and question ourselves, how does it resonate within our own individual, with our bodies? We invite you to come back as much as you'd like. This exhibition is going to be up through May 14th. We also have a number of opportunities, as I mentioned, to come back at the museum. If you're interested in class visits, please contact myself or Heather Bender, our master teacher. And one last opportunity, tomorrow, to continue this conversation, we are hosting the very first lunchtime conversations with curators. It's going to be a monthly series that happens throughout this semester. It's myself and Nicole Crawford. Tomorrow our special guest is Jordan Schnitzer, and we're going to have Q&A session, stories behind the artwork, and time to just have this conversation continue. So please join us from 12 to 12:30 tomorrow here at the Art Museum. I also encourage you to take advantage of all of the MLK DoD Days of Dialogue events. There's some really fascinating events happening that are as complex as the conversations here tonight. So thank you all for coming. Thank you so much to all of our panelists and special guests. And with that, please have a wonderful evening. Let's give them a big round of applause.